Well, sir, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg. Obviously, you're here representing the Central Bank of Ukraine. You have been in very busy meetings. I know you're at the Treasury now here in D.C. You're now at the IMF. You had a deal that was cut with the IMF for funding for the next 4 years. Roughly, I know that may be around $4 billion this year. And then on top of that, you have the funding that your European allies, the American allies, and other countries that support Ukraine have committed. So my question to you is, in terms of the funding needs of an economy that is managing essentially a war, would you say those are covered now, the funding for Ukraine in the medium term?
Thank you very much for having me here. So definitely having the financial support from our partners is very important in this challenging time for Ukraine. And frankly speaking, this year the situation looks much better compared with the previous year. Actually, so far we have secured already $42 billion of international support, including this $4.6 billion of the IMF. And that is also the part of the overall financial package which our international partners promised to provide us during the next 4 years in the amount of $115 billion, where $15.6 billion are the funds from the IMF.
And you say this year in terms of the funding is better, because I know Ukraine the last year when the war broke out said at one point there is a big gap between the money that is promised to the payments. And in that tension, there had been even speculation at one point that you could be into a default, when Ukraine obviously said we don't want to default into it, and was able to avoid it actually, which many believe was impossible, but actually you were able to service the outstanding debt that you had. Is that much better now, where you feel you have more visibility in terms of the funding coming in and the needs that you have?
That's true. Actually, last year we received $32 billion, but that was at some point it was not enough, to cover all budget needs. And actually, at the beginning of the war, the central bank started to help the government with the monetary financing of the budget needs. That was crucial in order to support the military expenses, social expenses, and of course, it also had its price. So as a result, inflation jumped to 26.6%. But this year, we hope that with this international support and also with the joint policy actions of the National Bank of Ukraine and the government, Ministry of Finance, we will be able to avoid the monetary financing. And we already see the outcomes, positive outcomes of this situation. Now inflation is 21.3%, much lower than at the beginning of the year. And we expect that this disinflation trend will continue.
And obviously one of the things that is, so peculiar and almost at times outstanding about the work that you do is that you set monetary policy in a country that is at war. Essentially, this is not normal central bank work. You have to manage so many different issues that are happening at the same time, and huge uncertainty. And in terms of the economy and the Ukrainian economy, obviously took a big hit because of the war that Russia has unleashed now in your country for a year. How do you see things moving this year? And what type of scenarios do you contemplate? Because nobody knows when this will end, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. Before the war, we as the central bank used to rely on inflation targeting framework, so quite orthodox, conducting quite orthodox monetary policy. That actually helped us a lot before the war, and also it helped us to gain the credibility. But of course, since the beginning of the war, we switched to completely different monetary policy regime. We pegged exchange rate to US dollar, we introduced harsh capital controls, and we used
Are they working? Do you see inflows of money, perhaps?
We see the inflows of the official financing. Meanwhile, we try to manage the capital outflow, capital flight from the country using these capital controls, and so far we are quite successful in that. As I said already, we see this strong downward trend for inflation. So we were able to accumulate international reserves, which provide us additional comfort. And also we were able, in these challenging times, we were able to safeguard monetary and financial stability. Yeah, and actually based on that, we expect that this year, the economy will start to recover from the huge decline of GDP of 29% last year.
It was almost 30% contraction in an economy, and this is huge. And essentially, it's what a war will do to an economy. That's the impact of it. It is very big. But you say maybe this year you could see, obviously still in contraction, but better than expected. And I wonder, maybe perhaps even positive growth in some areas now that the energy situation has become more stable?
That's true. Actually, in January, we downgraded our forecast for GDP growth this year to 0.2%. But taking into account that the situation in energy sector has been much better compared with our expectations. Actually, since the mid of February, we have not experienced blackouts, electricity outages. So we think that now we may revise our forecast upwards, and most probably we will do that in the end of April, when we will announce the updated macroeconomic forecast.
So you see room for, I'm not sure perhaps how much you can reveal 2 weeks ahead, but also we know that maintaining the economy was also important from the morale perspective of Ukraine, to also say we can prove that we can do better than expected and actually fight. There's an economic war that's going on too. So I'm not sure how much you can reveal, but obviously, what would be your message to a country like Russia? They obviously wanted to cripple your economy.
No, actually, last year, so I may refer to the last year's data. So actually last year, many forecasters, including the World Bank, IMF, expected that the economy will contract by 45%. The final outcome happened to be much better compared with these expectations. It is still a huge decline, but still, I suppose that the final outcome showed the resilience of the Ukrainian economy. Also, it highlighted the international support, and that is important for us to continue to support our military efforts.
Of course, which obviously you have to also fund. And when it comes to the currency, because if I believe I'm correct, and I'm pretty sure because it was a story that I followed very closely, last summer you had to devalue once, and at that point that was it. You don't predict there will be more devaluations, and for many who may not be familiar perhaps with Ukraine, you have your official rate, but then also an exchange that may happen on the streets, let's say. That gap, how do you see it between the effective and perhaps the one that people may use?
You are completely correct. Actually, last year in June, July, we were in very, I would say, unsecured situation, in very dangerous situation. We had to depreciate our currency by 25% in order to have the chance to safeguard our international reserves, which at that time fell to $22 billion. Also at that time, before this depreciation of the official rate, the spread between the cash exchange rate on the streets and the official exchange rate was almost 25%. So we did this step on the fixed market. So we also tightened monetary conditions. We introduced a number of unorthodox measures, and at the end, now what we have our international reserves, which are $10 billion higher compared with the situation in last summer. So we have the spread, which was narrowing and now does not exceed 3% compared with the official, the spread between the official rate and the cash exchange rate. So, and
can you expect that to stay like this?
Yeah, actually,
no more changing of the currency. In fact, the 2-3 gap stayed constant at that point.
That is one of our policy targets. So we would like to keep this spread as narrow as it now, at least. Yeah, but of course in the future. So this spread that is the result of our harsh capital controls and the lack of the free flows of the capital between the official sector and the cash market.
And these controls, which are obviously exceptional measures, it is understood you will keep them for as long as the war is going on.
Not for the end of the war. Actually, with the IMF, we have the structural benchmark, the development of the strategy for the gradual FX liberalization, gradual return to the more flexible exchange rate, and reintroduction of inflation targeting. So we hope to finalize this strategy by the end of June and prepare ourselves as conditions allowed for moves to gradually ease these capital controls and move to the
Which is why some say, you're almost doing magic. This is a central bank that has to perform this policy, but also does it in exceptional circumstances. And what you say is that you want to do as normal as possible in a situation that's not normal. I mean,
yeah, that's we try to come back to normal as fast as possible. Again, as conditions allow. But again, we understand that all our measures, which we introduced since the beginning of the war, they helped us to safeguard financial and monetary stability. But at the same time, they also have their own price for the economy. And definitely, they create distortions. They create some unhappiness of the businesses, of the households. So definitely, we would like to move forward and come back, return the normality.
And I have to ask you two final questions. One is obviously you're in D.C. You've been to the IMF. You were at the Treasury. You've had a lot of meetings with a number of colleagues. What is the message that you get from them? Do you still feel or perceive that the support is solid, or do you worry about maybe there's fatigue, it feels far, this war unfortunately continues, or is it still as strong as it was
Actually,
months ago?
I'm very encouraged by the messages we receive from different officials of US administration and also from our colleagues at the IMF. It seems that the message remains very strong. So the democratic world is ready to support Ukraine as long as it needed. And of course, that is a very strong message to the global.
And of course, everyone is paying attention to Ukraine and this counteroffensive, which is for another colleague of yours perhaps a question, but I know when I was recently in Ukraine that is a hope of Ukrainians, that this counteroffensive will happen soon. But as a final question though, and we're here at the IMF, and the reality is it's one day before this wraps, and we don't know whether there will be a communique at the end of the session, because once again, we know that Russia has serious problems, they say, with calling the war a war. For a lot of people, a war is a war, and it's been going on for a year. To water down the language, to not have a statement. The same thing happened at the G20. At one point, what do you respond to this? What's the point of even doing this?
I see.
To be here if you can't agree to a communique.
To be honest, it seems that our world divided into the two paths. The Russia, which communicates completely different messages compared to the civilized world, which supports Ukraine and calls the war the war. So and I suppose that we have to hear the civilized democratic world which continues to support Ukraine.
And assuming there's no communique, which has been the case at the G20 finance ministers, was the case of the foreign ministers, Russia again always taking an issue with the war, and they do not want this war there. Obviously, as you say, the West says it is a war, so we want that line there. But in your view, is it better to not have a communique than a bad communique? Let's just not have a communique and call it what it is, even if it's not on paper.
Frankly speaking, it's very difficult for me to answer this question. I'm not a very big expert in the global diplomatic communications, so I would, frankly speaking, I don't know the answer on that.
But for you, as a war, you feel we're going to win it. I mean, your morale is as high as it was.
Yeah, the war is the war, and we have to win it. And the world actually has to see Ukraine winning this world. That definitely, that Ukrainian victory will be beneficial for the globe, not only for us, but for the whole world.